Countdown to Halloween 2022, featuring eerie and uncanny tales of haunts, ghosts, and suspense. Every Monday at exactly midnight, a new story will appear on Storylink Radio's YouTube channel as we count down to Halloween 2022. You will have 7 days to listen, then the next one will appear. Each story will be 13 to 30 minutes long. And now, tonight's story from Storylink Radio. The Mummy Hand, a story of one Christmas Eve in Egypt by Adeline Sergeant. Yes, it is a rather odd story, and I can never help thinking of it at Christmas time. But my wife says there's something uncanny about it, so I don't usually refer to it in her presence. But I will tell you what happened if you like, and a very odd experience I had on Christmas Eve when I was in Upper Egypt. I had had a rather a run of ill luck, so I say. I was engaged to Mabel, but her father was doing his best to break off that engagement because I was such a bad match for her, he said. Well, perhaps he was right. To begin with, I had scarcely any money, except what I made by illustrations for papers and magazines. And old Sir John did not take a very high view of the artistic profession. And then my health had broken down, and the doctor said I ought to winter in a warm climate, which did not look very well for the future, did it? Well, old Sir John was quite kind and paternal, but inexorable too. My dear boy, he had said to me, I like you immensely, and Mabel likes you too, but as long as you are a pauper and an invalid, it is not much good proposing to marry her. For I think too well of you to suppose that you want to live upon my money. Now, it was a little hard to listen to the statement of that kind, but frankly, I had to swallow it because I did not want to quarrel with Sir John, and I knew that Mabel would be true to me. So I said goodbye to both of them, and I made my way to the office of the paper which I worked. The editor was Wilkins, an awfully kind chap, Wilkins. I told him the whole story, and he said a great many pleasant things to me about my work, and he told me that he would consult with the directors and see whether there was not some permanent post they could offer me. Wilkins was as good as his word, really. The very next day I got a proposal from him that I should go out to Egypt at the expense of the paper and visit the scene of some recent excavations, making sketches as I went of temples, statues, sarcophagi, or not really anything that struck me as interesting. They proposed to utilize these sketches for partly the paper, but also for a set of articles on the buried cities of Egypt and partly for a handbook on Egyptian antiquities that somebody or other connected with the firm was going to bring out. Anyway, he said that they would pay me handsomely for the job and that I could take my own time over it and so forth, and they would not grudge any reasonable expenses. They also intimated that if I acquitted myself well, I could count upon permanent employment as one of the staff. Now, this, of course, was good news for me, and I closed with their offer immediately. I saw Mabel at once and said goodbye to her, and then started immediately for the November fogs were coming on, and I had a nasty cough that I wanted to get rid of. Now, naturally, I knew nothing at that time of Egyptian history or hieroglyphics, and I can assure you that I had never heard of the name of Mr. Flinders Petrie, so I had my work cut out for me, even on the voyage to get up the subject. Now, I need not dwell upon my difficulties nor upon the steps I took to start my expedition. I reported myself to a bigwig, and I got as much information as I could about the recent discoveries. Thanks to the introductions I had brought, I lost very little time in getting to work. And by the middle of December, I was comfortably established in my own dahabiyah, and I had got some distance up the Nile. Now, I must tell you, though without wishing to boast, that I have always had a rather knack at languages. I can usually become pretty fluent in a new tongue in 2 or 3 months' time, and Arabic was not entirely new to me because, my father was something of an Oriental scholar, and I had learnt various Eastern languages from him. So that it was not altogether remarkable that I should soon put myself into communication with any Arabs I came across, and more particularly with the Bedouin tribes upon the river banks. They soon learned to understand the interest I took in old tombs and temples, and of course I did my best to ingratiate myself with them because I thought it very likely that they might know of places upon which no Englishman's eyes had rested, and the discovery of which might add to the value of my work and also to my reputation. It was also lucky for me that on one or two occasions I was able to give some assistance to a boy who turned out to be the favorite son of one of the sheiks. In point of fact, I saved the young monkey from being gobbled up by a crocodile, and the sheik's gratitude was boundless, or so at least it seemed to me. I may as well add that in considering the matter afterwards, I thought there had been a good deal of deliberate calculation mixed up with it. He came to me one day, and after the usual greetings, a cup of coffee, and the chabuk which were handed to me, he intimated that he had something special to say. Would I like to go with him to a city partially buried beneath the sand, which no Englishman had ever seen? Well, I asked him a good many questions about it, and what he said distinctly raised my curiosity. "It is the city of the princes," said the sheik, with a face like a mask and eyes which sedulously avoided mine. He was a handsome old man, brown and lithe and slender, as Arabs generally are, but of great stature and considerable strength. His features were regular and delicate. He wore no beard, and his arched eyebrows and fine dark eyes lent a rather peculiar character to his face. He had very beautiful hands. I used to watch the movement of the long, slender fingers as if I were fascinated by them, and yet I hardly knew why. I had already received hints from Cairo that old Sheikh Mohammed was not altogether to be trusted, and indeed I believed him to be the most thoroughgoing scoundrel and cutthroat on the banks of the Nile. But, he had the supple grace of a tiger, and I shall never forget the velvety softness of his eyes. He sat cross-legged before me on a carpet, his white robes and turban immaculately clean, his demeanor as cool and dignified as that of an emperor. But he looked more like a sage and a poet than a Bedouin sheik. "Why do you call it the city of the princess?" I inquired. He bowed gravely, touching his forehead and chest. "She was the daughter of a great king," he said. "It was by her orders that the city was built, and her tomb is in the midst." "Her tomb? Does that still exist? Can you take me to see it?" I cried. "If the Effendi has no fears," said Sheikh Mohammed, "I can show him the place where the princess used to lie." "But does she not lie there now?" I asked. "Who then has broken open her tomb? You say no Englishman has been there before." The sheik simply shook his head. "In this land there are many thieves," he observed, "and perhaps the body was removed to a place of greater safety. But the Effendi shall see and judge for himself." Now it is needless to say that I consented with alacrity. Such a chance was not to be despised. I should see what no other Englishman had seen, and I might make valuable and important discoveries. I waited with impatience until the moment came for setting out upon my expedition to the buried city of the princess. The sand of Egypt is as the waves of the sea. It overthrows and submerges the works of man, and shows merely the smooth, unbroken surface above them, where no one can discern or even guess at the existence of the things that have been lost. As we journeyed over the vast expanse, I wondered how it was possible for my guides to know their way, nor for their eye to distinguish any landmark by which our destination could be known, for, as the sheik had explained to me, we were not going to look for ruin visible to the eye of man, but for some subterranean passages and buried cities which had not seen the light of day for hundreds of years. We had set out at dawn, but the sun was high before we paused at what looked to me like a flat round stone buried in the sand and shaded by one or two palm trees. The ground, by its verdure, showed the presence of underground water springs. I looked on with the deepest interest while my escorts formed their camp, and then removed the stone from its place. As I had expected, I saw that it was covered the entrance to some underground buildings, for there were stone steps, and above them a domed roof and a passage into which the sun's rays penetrated only a little ways. The sheik, who was accompanied only by two of his sons and one or two of his most trustworthy servants, looked at me with triumph in his eyes. "Did I not tell you?" he said. "And now, if the Effendi chooses, I will show him the burial place of the princess. Will the Effendi follow, or, with an unmistakable touch of scorn in his voice, or is the Effendi afraid? For it must be confessed that I had hesitated, as a breath of chill, dank air came from the vault like a foreshadowing of death. But at the sheik's question, my courage returned to me, and I haughtily begged him to hold his peace and go forward. I shall never forget the curious sensations produced in me by that expedition. One of the servants went first, holding a lantern, and then came the sheik, and then myself, while one of the sheik's sons brought up the rear. But for the light of the lamp, we should not have been able to see a step before us. The steps went down for some distance and were succeeded by a level passage, but that also went down until we seemed to be descending into the very bowels of the earth. And worse than that, the walls narrowed on each side until I almost thought that it would be impossible to proceed. The lithe figures of the Arabs hopped easily from the narrow steps, but I, a tall and broad-shouldered Englishman, had considerable difficulty in squeezing myself along that passage. Once or twice I almost came to a full stop, but it occurred to me that there was nothing to be done but to go forward. One could never turn in that narrow passage. It was a case of going further on or being wedged forever in the darkness. At last, to my unspeakable relief, the passage widened until it opened out into a large hall or chamber, supported by pillars and illuminated by dim radiance which must have come from the outer day, although I failed to see the shafts which must have communicated with the outer world. But what surprised me was that there seemed to be no outlet from this chamber. Looking around it, I saw no door and no passage, except the one by which we had come. But the sheik smiled at my bewilderment. "Look up," he said. "On your right. Yes, on your right side, to the east. Look up." He took the lantern from the Arab's hand and hung it aloft, so that I could see a great opening high in the wall. And as the light streamed into it, I could see that it was a vast and magnificent chamber adorned with brilliant wall paintings, with carved images of sphinxes and colossi, and with some great objects in the middle of the chamber which I could not at first make out. "What is it?" I asked, pointing to the black central mass. "It is the tomb," he said briefly. Look, I will show you." And to my surprise, he put his feet into a small crevice or a cleft in the rock, and he swung himself up to the opening with the lightness and dexterity which only an Arab could have shown. Then, standing aloft in the large, dim chamber, his white robes making him a noticeable object, even in the semi-obscurity, he looked more like a phantasmal form, some presiding genius of the place, more than mere human flesh and blood. The other Arabs clambered after him with lighted torches, which they held high above their heads, thus enabling him to see the wonders of the place. There was an enormous sarcophagus of rose granite, supported on a great marble slab with granite pillars. It was here, no doubt, that the body of the Egyptian princess reposed, a mummified body wrapped with spices and linen clothes, which I ardently desired to unroll in order that I might add some scrap of knowledge to the great sum total of Egyptian archaeology. But alas, disappointment awaited me. I tried in vain to swing myself up to the opening in the inner chamber, but as the Arabs before me had done, but I was too big and heavy and, frankly, klutzy for the operation. The crevices which had afforded foothold to the Arabs did not suffice for me, and even when two of the men supported me and the others tried to pull me up by my arms, it was found the attempt was impossible. The only way was to come there again with ropes and other implements so that I might for myself examine the chamber and all that it contained. The Arabs were evidently disappointed with the result of our visit. Evidently, they had wanted me to examine the sarcophagus, but I told them I would do so in the course of a couple of days, and that in the meantime, if they would keep silence, they should be handsomely rewarded. Now, there was certainly nothing more to be done that day, and we determined to make our way to the upper earth again. I took some hasty notes of the place where we stood, and of the different things I could see, not failing to remark that the great stone coffin had already been, to some extent, tampered with, for its great cover had been removed and partially broken. But the contents of the sarcophagus, I was assured, was still intact, and I was consoled with the thought of opening for myself the gilded mummy case and reviving the poor mummied body from its swaddling bands. I went back to my dahabeah in a state of wild excitement, and I occupied myself for some hours in getting ready or sending messages for the implements that I thought I would require. On the second day, however, I received a shock. My movements had evidently not been unobserved. The government had got wind of my private researches, so at least I supposed, for here was an official letter from the director of the museum in Cairo, stating that he was on his way to join me, as he thought that some valuable Egyptian remains were to be discovered near the village, beside which my boat was anchored. Now, I know very well that all antiquities belong to the Egyptian government and may not be carried out of the country, and that anyone who could be proved to be defrauding the government in this matter was liable to punishment. Severe. Of course, I had not meant to appropriate anything that I might find, but I did want to have the honor and glory of my discoveries all to myself, and I was very much annoyed that Monsieur Bougier should in any way anticipate me. But there was nothing to be done, so, well, he might arrive at almost any moment, and would certainly not be later than the following day. Thus I sat and fumed secretly while I gave all necessary orders for the entertainment of a guest. In the dusk of the evening, the Sheikh Mohammed sent word that he wished to come on board and speak to me. I received him with all the ceremony which he considered proper to his position, and as we sat opposite to each other, drinking coffee and smoking in our respective modes, for he preferred a hookah, while I restricted myself to the customary cigar, he entered, after some preamble upon the subject of conversation he wished to make. "The Effendi has had a letter." "True," I answered, oracularly. "The letter is from the Great One in the city, who has control of everything that is ancient in this country. He comes soon and will demand tribute." "How the devil do you know?" I asked, rather forgetting my manners in my surprise. The glimmer of a triumphant smile passed across that handsome old face. "Pardon, Effendi, but all the people know it. The letter was carried to Effendi by a messenger now, who has seen letters of the same kind at other times. It is of the blue color, and it has the name of the great man in writing upon it. If the Effendi looks at it, he will see that it is so. We all know the look of that covering and the signature." I hastily withdrew the director's epistle from my pocket. I looked at the envelope. It was blue, official-looking document, and the director had carefully inscribed his signature on the outside. Possibly he had no idea the Arabs knew it just as well as an Englishman or a Frenchman would have done. "Well, you could not have read it," I exclaimed. "No, Effendi, but we know when a letter of that kind comes, a great one follows. You'll be here tomorrow or the next day, is it not so?" "Yes, yes, you are right," I said, thinking it no use to deny what was so well known. "And what of that?" "It is just this, Effendi. Pardon me, but the coming of the master means to ruin my house. The Effendi does not know the methods of the Great One. He will come and ask questions, and he will frighten those of my household and force them to tell things that they should not. Also, he searches our houses and ourselves, and if he finds but a mummy finger, or a tarnished ornament of no value, or a little carbon stone, he sends us to the Black Prison, Effendi, and he deprives us of all our goods. Now, the Effendi knows that there are always small things that even the children pick up in the sands, and some of them have been brought by chance into my tent, and therefore if the great Lord comes and searches me and my house, now behold, Effendi, behold, I am a doomed man, and a price will be put upon my head." "Well, not quite so bad as all that," I said. "There'll be a fine, I suppose, and perhaps imprisonment. I don't know, but you'll get off lightly, I think. Besides, why don't you clear out all those curiosities and make a present of them to the government if you're afraid they'll be discovered?" The old man's eyes twinkled. I was somewhat inexperienced in Oriental wiles, but it struck me that Sheikh Mohammed was bent upon concealing something valuable for himself. And I hardly knew whether to aid and abet him, or to, side with the director, who was certainly very much in my way. I fell back upon my generalities. "Well, we must all obey the law," I said. The things belong to the government and will give you a fair price for your labor in digging, but if you keep and sell them to strangers, most assuredly, Sheik, you'll be put in jail and suffer great loss besides." The Sheik said nothing. His hands had been folded in the large white garment which he wore, but he now slid them out of the folds and exposed them to my view. On one of the long brown fingers I at once observed there gleamed a jewel of extraordinary size and luster. It seemed to be a blood-red ruby set in a dim gold. Without a word, he quietly slipped it off his finger and held it out to me upon his flat, thin palm. "Amazing!" I exclaimed. "What a magnificent ring! Why, it's ancient. Where did you find it?" He made no immediate answer, but motioned to me to take the ring. "It is for the Effendi. The Effendi can keep it for himself." "Antika?" I said, using the word every Arabian knows. "If I take it, I must give it up to Monsieur Bonjour." But I took it from the Sheik's hand. I tried it on, conscious at the same time of a sudden flash of something like triumph from the Sheik's brilliant dark eyes, though what he had to triumph about I could not exactly see. "It is yours, Effendi," he said in a low voice. "But do not show it to the great man from Cairo. Keep it safely, for it is worth much gold." This is impossible," I said, gazing at the jewel as though it fascinated me, for I could not accept such a valuable gift, and I had not enough money to purchase it. "Well, then keep it for a little while. Keep it until this visit is overpast, and we will speak of barter." "Ah, now I understand," I cried, bursting into hearty laughter. "The fact is, you want me to conceal this ring from the eyes of the officials because you know very well you have stolen it. It would be very convenient for you, I have no doubt, if I kept it concealed until the director had gone back to Cairo and then presented it to you again." I spoke in English, but I think the Sheik understood me, although he sat grave and immovable. "Where did you find it?" I asked curiously in Arabic. "Where we went together, you and I, in the chamber of the dead princes." "You have not meddled with the sarcophagus, have you?" "Allah forbid. I have left it for the Effendi and their servants. But the ring, this ring has virtues. Without it, no one can open the door which leads to the secret chamber. Unless the Effendi will keep it safe, we cannot go to see that chamber again." I began to understand. The ring was a bribe, most assuredly. I was to conceal it and return it to the old Sheik when the director had returned to Cairo, and as my reward I would be shown to the sarcophagus and be allowed to explore its hidden treasures. Under these circumstances, what should I do? It flashed across my mind that if I refused to keep the ring or presented it to the government officials, I should lose the Sheik's friendship, and with it probably every chance of making discoveries in that part of Egypt. Any discoveries. With the loss of this chance went also a certain amount of my chance of winning Sir John's consent to my marriage with Mabel. I really could not afford to sacrifice the old Sheik's protection for the sake of a scruple, and yet it was hardly fair or honest to defraud the government of what was its due. Well, I should like to examine the ring a little," I said. "For the present I will keep it and return it to you later on. I should like to find out what these hieroglyphics mean," I said, and I pointed to some characters roughly inscribed on the inside of the little circlet. Not a muscle of the Sheik's face changed, although he must have thought that he had secured a tremendous triumph. He went on in a bolder tone. "There is one other thing, Effendi. One of my house has found for himself an ancient mummy, such as the English love to take away to their own country. We dare not keep it because of the search which will shortly be at our house. But if the Effendi would but bury it for himself." "The mummy as well as the ring?" I observed. "How much more? No, I don't want any mummies, Sheik. Why don't you bury it in the ground until the director is gone, and if you want to get off free?" It was a very improper statement to make, no doubt. The old man's eyes twinkled shrewdly. "It is difficult to do without many knowing, and I fear that we should be betrayed. But if the Effendi will allow me to bring it to his boat, he can see if there is some little corner where it can be kept safe from prying eyes. It is only a small mummy, Effendi. It is not quite complete. It is only partially unwound. And if the Effendi would but keep it a little while. I laughed in spite of myself. I have no room for it. And I should like to know what the director would say if he found me concealing a valuable mummy. No, no. Be content, Sheik. I've got your ring, but really I cannot take your mummy, too. But perhaps there was something in my face that told of yielding. For at night, when the darkness had fallen and I was sitting alone in my cabin writing up my journal, the Sheik himself reappeared with two of his sons, informing me in the humblest of tones that they had found a hiding place for the mummy if I would but let it remain. When I inquired the nature of this hiding place, I was quietly shown the upper bunk of my sleeping apartment, which had hitherto stood empty and was a receptacle for all kinds of rubbish. It was true, certainly. No one would think of hunting there for curiosities. And the men's ingenuity was so great that I at last consented to allow their precious burden to be deposited there. And early next morning, Monsieur Bourget arrived. I entertained Monsieur Bourget at dinner. He was a clever, amiable little Frenchman, full of anecdotes, very inquisitive concerning my relations with the Arabs in their neighborhood. Especially was he anxious to know whether I thought that the Sheikh Mohammed had made any recent discoveries. I was pleased to be able to state that I did not know. It was a rather elusive answer, I'm afraid, because I implied that I did not know whether the Sheikh's discoveries were recent or not. Only I did not take the director into my confidence respecting the buried city, the mummy in my bunk, or the wonderful ring. He would know all about these things, no doubt, in good time, but I was not going to betray the Sheikh's confidence. All in all, we spent a very pleasant evening together, and he did not leave me until late. It must be confessed that I was rather glad to get rid of him, though, as my thoughts wandered incessantly to the concealed treasures in my cabin. I was restlessly anxious to know that the ring was safe. I went so far at last as to take the ring from its hiding place and conceal it in my pocket. I should have worn it had I not been afraid of attracting Monsieur Bourget's attention. But when he was gone, I took it out and I slipped it over my fourth finger, as it was too small for any of the others. There was something about it that fascinated me, that ring. It had a certain ring to it, and I wished with all my heart that I could afford to buy it, and that it was fair for me to do so. I knew very well that I should have to advise Sheikh Mohammed to report his treasures to the director, or, if not, should be ultimately obliged to do so myself. But at present I very much wished to put off that evil day. Moved by new strange impulses for which I could scarcely account, I took the candle and let its rays fall upon the covered shelf which contained the Sheik's mummy. I wondered vaguely why he had attached so much importance to it. Finally, I took off the covering and made a superficial examination of the mummied figure. It had been partially enrolled, and I could make out that the mummy was that of a young woman, slight and small, but evidently from the nature of the wrappings and the spices employed, a person of some distinction. I speedily made another discovery which startled me a little. The right hand had been severed from the body, but not taken away. It lay amongst the wrappings, long, brown, ghastly, and it struck me that one of the fingers had also been mutilated, though of this in the dim light I could not be sure. I resolved to ask the sheik for the full history of this mummy and why the hand had been severed from the arm. The full significance of it did not strike me at the time, but I came to see afterwards that it was easy to conjecture why the sheik or one of his families had committed this outrage upon the dead. I recovered the mummy. I put the ring in a box, which I locked for greater security, and I went to bed. I think, yes, I'm quite certain I never had a worse night. I woke continually, and I dreamt frightful dreams at intervals. The air seemed curiously thick, and there were strange rustlings, probably caused by the presence of some lizard or scorpion which had crawled into the boat. At last I lighted a candle, and I read till morning. Then, feeling strangely weary and unrefreshed, I got up and I joined Monsieur Bourget, who was holding a sort of bit de justesse on the river bank. Ciel! It is the 24th, he ejaculated as he made his last note towards the close of the sitting. It is the eve of Noel, and we so far away from all Christian festivities. Oh, you, Mr. Omeral, will be able, I hope, to finish a Christmas dinner, no? I will supply the wine, which I brought from Cairo. Is it a bargain? It is indeed, I said with satisfaction. I was thinking that my Christmas day would be a somewhat dreary one, but in your company, Monsieur Bourget, I shall no doubt spend a very agreeable time. Very well, then, said Monsieur, in extremely good humor. Then you will dine with me tonight, my friend, and I will dine with you tomorrow on Christmas Day. That is so, is it not? He gave me a very good dinner that evening on board the Dahiba, and I came back to my own boat in good spirits, though by no means unduly excited. I mention this fact because a kind friend has now and then suggested that I had dined too freely. I can assure you that I, Eustace Umarad, was never more sane, more clear-headed, or light-hearted than I was that Christmas Eve. When I looked at the dim, glimmering waters of the Nile, and I thought of the Christmas bells that were ringing out across the old northern lands, of the girl that I knew was waiting for me at home. I wish I could send her a Christmas gift, I said to myself. By the way, if that ring of the sheik's would please her immensely. I wonder if I could get Muhammad to sell it at a low price and Bouger to wink at my keeping it. It's too small for a man. It is evidently meant for a woman's hand. And so saying, I unlocked the box, I took out the ring, I admired it, and I held it up to the light. And then I put it, as I had done, on the little finger of my left hand. But this time I did not take it off again. I looked upon it as a possible gift to Mabel, and I pleased myself with the idea of wearing it first. I fell asleep in my berth almost immediately, but in a short time I woke just as I had done on the previous night with the sensation of having had a horrible dream of which I cannot remember the details. I said some angry words to myself on the subject of these bad nights, and then I composed myself to sleep again. But this time I did not lose consciousness. I dreamt, and yet I was awake, for I knew that what I saw was not all a dream. It seemed to me the air was full of a strange presence, that some hungry, malignant creature was going to and fro in the room, not speaking or crying out, but full of deliberate enmity toward myself, and a determination to take my very life. Once or twice the thing seemed to come near me, then drew back as if afraid. I knew, in a vague way, that it waited for me to sleep, and I tried, with a growing horror which I cannot express, to wake myself thoroughly, and to drive away from me this creature of darkness to the realm to which it belonged. But I was paralyzed. I could not move hand or foot. The terror of a sort of nightmare was upon me, and I was absolutely helpless. The thing certainly came nearer. It hovered over me. It almost brushed my face. Then it seemed to take shape and form. I knew it. Only my eyelids were shut, and I saw beside me for one dazzling moment a young and beautiful girl with long almond eyes, full of passion and fire, red lips, and brown shapely limbs on which glimmered costly robes, jewels, and flowers. I felt the scent of rich blossoms overpower my faculties, and yet mixed with it there was a strange, rank odor, like of corruption and death. Yet the girl's glowing face, the lithe yet rounded figure, breathed nothing but life and energy. It would have been the most beautiful vision I ever beheld, had the face possessed any softness or tenderness of expression. But it was disfigured by terror and by hate. It seemed to me that she sought for something that she could not find, and that she was determined to avenge herself on me as upon an enemy. Her slender brown fingers closed upon my throat, and then at that moment I knew that one of the fingers was bleeding and broken. There was a strange red circlet above the slender wrist. And then I knew no more. I did not come to myself for some hours, and I believe I narrowly escaped brain fever. It seems that at that supreme moment of my nightmare, if so it may be called, I heard a strange, stifled cry, which brought Saeed, the most faithful servant that I ever possessed, to my side. He said that I seemed to be in convulsions, with my hands tearing at my throat and my face almost black, and there were strange discolored marks, such as he could only be made by clutching fingers upon the flesh. He told me that Monsieur Bougère had doctored me to the best of his ability, and that the old sheik had manifested every sign of alarm and distress when he heard that I had been taken ill. He had also demanded back from Saeed the precious mummy which he had conveyed to my cabin. But Saeed, with infinite reverence for things in his master's apartment, had refused to let him touch the mummy figure. which still therefore reposed upon the empty berth opposite my own. As soon as I was able, although still feeling very weak, I crawled out of my bunk and I lifted the coverings with which the mummy was hidden. But someone has been here, I ejaculated involuntarily. Or you, Saeed, have rearranged the wrappings. Saeed swore that he had not touched the figure, and also that he had not admitted anyone into the cabin. But all the draperies and wrappings had been rearranged and lay in straight, stiff folds about the figure, almost as if the swathing was complete. The hands were entirely hidden, but my curiosity impelled me to remove some of the easily loosened bandages, and then I saw what I had vaguely expected to see. That upon one of the slender brown fingers of the mummy's hand was the ruby ring which I myself had worn when I went to sleep on Christmas Eve. I sent for Monsieur Bouget, and I confided to him the whole story. With his help, we partially unrolled the mummy, and we found it in a very good state of preservation. The face was especially perfect. It was that of a young girl, whose beauty it was easy to conjecture had been very great, and it seemed to me that it was the face of the same woman who had hovered over me, with cruel clutching fingers in my dreams. She was of a royal race, said Monsieur Bouget. The hieroglyphics tell us that, and here is a papyrus roll which we may be able to decipher. I remember hearing some tradition of this princess. She died of grief because of her lover's death, and was buried with his ring upon her hand. You must have heard this story, my friend. You dreamt that she came back from the dead to take back her ring. I did not dream at all, I answered, somewhat angrily. She, it, the thing, whatever it was here, and I saw it. Ha! Ah, well, said the little Frenchman placidly. There is no saying, then. We dream very wonderful things sometimes. It strikes me this mummy was taken from a sarcophagus that you saw in the buried city. The sheik wanted to steal a march upon us all, I should like to arrest him and hear what he has to say. But Sheikh Mohammed had fled. He had scented danger as soon as he knew that I was ill, and he and his family were never seen again. Nor could we recover a clue to the buried city, which still, therefore, remains unexplored. I entreated Bouget to let the dead Egyptian princess keep her ring, and he with some reluctance consented. But I could not persuade him to abandon the idea of adding the mummy to the other exhibits in his museum. And so she lies there to this day, in a glass case, duly ticketed and labeled, with her lover's ring still safe upon her mummy hand, and, well, perhaps with this she is content. But although I have been a happy and successful man for many years, and have married the girl I loved and spent a joyous Christmas in my own English home, I shall never forget the weird experiences of that gruesome Christmas Eve upon the Nile. And upon my throat I still carry, and shall carry as long as I live, the marks of that murderous mummy hand. You've just heard tonight's story from Storylink Radio's Countdown to Halloween 2022. Remember to come back for our next tale. Many more stories of all genres available to listen to and read along with now on our website at www.storylinkradio.com. Visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/StorylinkRadio. And visit our podcast for easy mobile listening anywhere, anytime. Just search for Storylink Radio on your favorite podcast provider. Oh, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and click that alert bell for Storylink Radio.